Three different people, that's a good start. 082.
Okay.
Half the bayonet shirt, very good.
Oh, yeah.
077, you gotta check yours, sir.
Right here.
Hey, all right, in the back, excellent. Four different.
All right. Hold on.
096. 96.
Draw again.
Okay.
Draw again.
Very generous of you. 082. 082. You guys, excellent.
Yeah, I feel bad.
Well, by all means.
Okay.
Go ahead. We do not mind.
How much battery do you
Go
have?
up here, whatever.
What do you think, Bob?
And we've got one more item back there, 087. 087.
Okay. 87, that's me.
Bob, all right, you gonna finish it off?
Yep, we'll
Very
finish it
good.
off.
All right, well, thank you everyone once again for joining us this evening for the last of our 2024-2025 season here at the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. I'd like to turn over things briefly to our ever generous host, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, with Dana Show. Dan?
Thanks, Matt. I'm actually going to talk for an hour and a half before Garry. No, that's a joke. We've had some technical difficulties, but Melissa Lynn, our Director of Marketing and Communications, has stepped in to live broadcast this on her phone. So that's what she's doing there, in case you're curious. Thank you all again for showing up here. I'm Dana Show, Director of Interpretation. I appreciate you guys coming every third Thursday, although this month it took me by surprise because it's a little earlier in the month. And I was like, I almost forgot about this yesterday. So I don't want to take any more time other than if you haven't already pick up a free copy of our member magazine off the back table. And if you haven't become a member, please consider doing so. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Matt, and I'll go back and watch this fantastic discussion.
Thank you, Dan. And again, of course, thank you very much to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine for having us. They've been our host here at the museum for a number of years, and we greatly appreciate that support and the use of the YouTube channel that allows us to put these presentations out there. Now, our speaker this evening, the culmination of our season this year, is, of course, a man that needs very little introduction, so I'm not going to talk very long. Garry Adelman is the chief historian of the American Battlefield Trust. You have seen him on Facebook, on YouTube, on probably, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of videos out there, and of course, hundreds upon hundreds of battlefield tours. Garry actually shares my alma mater, Michigan State University, so that's something that we touched on very early on in my early career. So let's give him a big round of applause for being here tonight with the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable.
Before we go live, sorry everybody, I'm trying to share this on my page. Here we go. Boom. National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So I'm super happy to be here. This is the third or fourth time I've spoken to this roundtable, going way back to, if anybody remembers, when you were in like the chapel of FSK Cemetery. I think that was around 1999 or 2000, so I'm really happy to be back here. I love talking about Civil War photography, and I appreciate the National Museum of Civil War Medicine hosting, as they have for so many years. So we're going to get into the Western Theater here, and literally, the rebels shot first. Both literally and in terms of photography. The first photos of the Civil War were taken by Southern photographers right after it started. Within a day, they were recording photos here at Fort Sumter. Now, this isn't going to last, okay? When you look at the map of the country and you look where you're going to start covering and how you're going to supply yourself, it comes into relief. First of all, the blockade is going to work before long, and the South is not going to say, okay, we need guns, we need ammunition, let's make sure we slip photochemicals through the blockade. Like, this wasn't high on their list, and when they did have photochemicals, they are going to focus on the much more profitable portraiture trade, like inside their studios and whatnot. These Civil War photos that I'll show today are done on spec, hoping maybe you can make some money. There's another practical thing too, is that here you have, if you're a Civil War photographer, you could go from Gettysburg up top there down to Petersburg and hit 15 or 20 battlefields on the way. Many of y'all have done this, of course, while you're traveling along the eastern seaboard, and you know how many you can see. But then if you look over here and say, well, you know, I'm at Atlanta, let me go up to Chickamauga. You know what, I have 3 weeks to spare. Let me go out to Pea Ridge or something like that. The distance involved with covering the Western Theater also just favored northern photographers on the eastern seaboard. And therefore, this is a long-winded way of saying, most Civil War photos, the outdoor ones, the documentary ones that you see in books and whatnot, not the portraits, but the documentary ones, were taken by northern photographers, mostly in the east. Okay, so trying to focus on the West here is somewhat special. It's also needed because here you have this little spot called the East. Okay, it's part of Virginia, it's a little bit of West Virginia, it's part of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Okay, and somehow if you go south and east from Petersburg, you are in the West. Okay, if you go south from Petersburg, you're in the West, and then everything else is just the West. Now, this makes sense to some of y'all. Okay, but unfortunately for people in the West, back during the Civil War and to this day, you talk to Rangers out at Chickamauga, Vicksburg, Shiloh, they've got a bone to pick with Gettysburg and Antietam because back then and now, they don't get the attention that they deserve, right? So it's like this sort of, like there's the East and then there's sort of just everything else. Now, it's even worse for some folks out there because it's one thing to be Fort Donelson in Tennessee, but man, the Pea Ridges and Glorieta Passes of the world have it even worse there in the Trans-Mississippi. Oh my God. If the West complains about not getting enough attention, the Trans-Miss has a whole different problem. But this program is meant to shine some more photographic light on the Western Theater and the area west of that even, so let's get into it a little bit. First, Civil War photographs are largely taken in the field using mobile darkroom wagons where they lived next to or beside them, and they were taken by using the wet plate process. This is a process where you coat a chemical sheet onto a glass plate. The glass plate looks like that, okay? You're gonna make it light sensitive, you're gonna put it in a light-proof box, run it out to the camera, which is already all set up, and you insert it in the camera, remove the light proofing, remove the lens cap, and then expose it for 3, 4, 5, 8, 12 seconds. Okay, it just really depends on the conditions at the time. But what I want to focus on here is this photographic negative. It is 4 by 10 inches. And most of us grew up with, what, 1 1/4 inch wide and 3/4 inch tall 35 millimeter negatives, okay? This thing is, depending on if you count both halves of the stereo negative, is, 25, 40 times larger than some of these early, let alone the Instamatic negatives at the time. And unlike some of the negatives that we grew up with, there's no grain like in the 35 millimeter negatives. There's no pixels like when you try to, zoom into a digital photo, okay? This is simply a chemical sheet, and it allows us to see great resolution. When you take a photo in your camera, this is what it looks like. It makes a negative. If you put it on a black background, it becomes a positive, and that's called an ambrotype. Okay, have you ever heard the word ambrotype? That is just a glass plate negative with something with a black background behind it, okay? You can also do this for a variety of things. Take the plate that you took. Again, the reason this is done this way is by using a twin lens camera. People realized even before there was photography that you could make something 3D by tricking the brain into thinking they were seeing it, as long as you took that picture or drew that picture an eye width apart. So they have a camera lens, two lenses an eye width apart. They can make these, and then you flip them around after you print them, and you have a stereo view. Of course, you all know this before, you've seen these before, you might have grown up with them in your parents' or grandparents' parlor, maybe some of you still have them to this day. And this is how people could travel the world, the Netflix of its day, okay? Because you could see the pyramids of Egypt and see the Leaning Tower of Pisa in 3D, and that's about as best as they could do. And since this is the West, I'm focusing on Vicksburg. The glass plate negative was near Big Black River. And I want to say that most of the photos I'm showing today are public domain, available for anybody to go check out and download in high resolution and explore. You type in Vicksburg at the Library of Congress, Princeton Photograph Division, you're going to get a whole lot of hits, and I think you're going to find something interesting no matter what, especially because of this incredible resolution on these glass plate negatives. Now, here's a photo, and maybe there's someone in the room who has a really good, digital SLR camera, and you're thinking, that's nothing, okay? Well, take this to heart. Let's say you have a great big SLR camera. Stand about 15 feet away from somebody okay? And go in perfect lighting conditions and see if you can see that person's fingerprints, okay? From 15 feet away, look at the cracks in his hands. If his palms were up, there's zero doubt that you'd be able to see his fingerprints. And I would suggest that the best cameras of today are just beginning to approach the resolution that we had more than 160 years ago, such as with this guy, a contraband at Brandy Station. But as we start to look in the Civil War in the West, we don't have any early photos, not remotely, of the Battle of Wilson's Creek out in the Trans-Mississippi. But in the beginning of 1862, a whole lot happens. The Union's going to capture 100,000 square miles of territory. I'll talk about this. But they're also making some progress elsewhere in the West, again, further east than Petersburg. This is New Bern, North Carolina. And in March of 1862, there's a lot going on in February, March of 1862. There's going to be battles there, and the Union will have a toehold. After gathering some things at Port Royal Sound and making some gains, they're going to eventually capture New Bern in the Battle of New Bern, and then they're going to occupy it. And wherever the soldiers are, photographers set up shop. And you can, in these historic towns, still just go and see the same houses today. And I really encourage you to, because it's super fun. In the meantime, out in the West, you have everybody's favorite general, Henry Hopkins Sibley. Everybody just really, he's got so many fans, him and Bragg, yeah. So they're going to go up from Texas through the Arizona Territory and into New Mexico Territory, both of which are New Mexico now in that area. And I think you know what happens. They're going to end up coming to grips with a Union force under the command of Canby at this place first called Fort Craig. And that is not far from a battlefield where the actual battle is called Valverde, okay? It is literally in the shadow of the Black Mesa right here. This is where the battles fought along the banks of the Rio Grande River, which has moved a few hundred yards. But they're going to have a stiff fight over there. Then, of course, Union troops are going to come down from Colorado, stop at Fort Union, and then go over to Glorieta Pass, where they're going to fight the Gettysburg of the West, okay? And let me assure you, it might be the Gettysburg of the West, but these are tiny armies compared to those in the East, excuse me. And you see why they weren't photographed early. We do have some, 19th century photos of the area, but none in the Civil War. In the meantime, further along the eastern seaboard, you have the Union reducing Fort Pulaski, designed in part by Robert E. Lee with its 9-foot thick walls, and here's the day of rifled artillery where brick and masonry forts are no longer effective, and here's Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer, there to capture pictures like this, showing where the casemate was broken up, open, and in detail. You'll see I zoom into a lot of pictures here. In detail, you can just see some of these Union soldiers right after the fort's capture in April of 1862. So you've got more happening in the West, of course, and Fort Donelson gets all the attention. Neither Fort Donelson or Fort Henry that you see is underwater now, or Fort Hyman have any early photos associated with them, so I'm showing you a map. I think you know that when the Union captures Fort Henry, it's not long until they move further eastward and capture Fort Donelson. That will result in the fall of Nashville, Tennessee, and that's going to set up a whole bunch of stuff, because now all the Confederate armies fall back. There's going to be fighting along the Mississippi River at Island Number 10 and Fort Pillow, while, of course, U.S. Grant has already moved south towards Shiloh, where the Confederates strike back in the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing or the Battle of Shiloh, okay? So I would suggest that understanding the Civil War in the East and in the West, both of these things consist of rather few grand movements. Sure, I'm cruising through them pretty fast here, but in the end, you start to see how the dominoes fall, how once Nashville fell, how Fort Donelson impacted the rest of it. Then they start to move south. There's going to be fighting around here, but then the Confederates are going to move north again, and the Confederates move south, and the Union chase them. It's pretty easy to understand it when you try to look at the grand movements. And of course, at the Battle of Shiloh, April 1862, we have exactly 3 known photos of this place. Some photographer went all the way there and recorded 3 photos, 2 of which are identical and only show these gunboats right here. One of which is the Tigris, and Grant is known, to have used one of these ships at some point, so you have it there. This is Pittsburgh Landing, one of the most famous places at Shiloh. So when you go there, you take a photo there. This was from my 3rd visit in 2011. And you go there. What I can't figure out is on this day, this must be the easiest photo ever to line up. The landing is still there, the river's there, and I somehow look all proud of myself. I'm not sure why. Check this out. I know what this is. In any case, I also took this picture that day, kind of looking down from the area. I knew I wasn't far enough back. So then I went back. Two or three trips later, I went further up the hill, and man, oh yeah. And the river has shifted a little bit, but I'm confident I'm in the right spot. I'm high up enough now here. So of course, after Shiloh, the Confederates fall back to Corinth, Mississippi, with its important rail crossing that you see there on the right. The Union's going to move very slowly under everybody's second favorite general, Henry Wager Halleck, and he's going to move toward Corinth with that force very, very slowly. The Confederates will burn a lot, they'll evacuate before the Union gets there, but then the Union's going to occupy it for the better part of the war, and photographers go there as well. They record so many outdoor photographs, and many of them show this sort of platform here, because this is right near the crossings of the railroad, the most important square 12 feet in America at the time, and that's the Tishomingo Hotel on the left, and right next to that, if I may, this is a photographic studio. You can see the skylight coming up where they can pull the cloth back, and that they're actually advertising some of the photos out front there. We know who these guys are, Armistead and White and other people like that. But you can go back there today. We know where the crossing is. It's still in the same spot. We know where the Tishomingo Hotel was. So you can do this. Now, everybody who's interested in Civil War photography might have a different bent. I just like to open a book like some of those, or some that were raffled off tonight, and I'm just going to page through them and look and imagine and read the captions. Other people like to zoom in. Some people like to collect them. Some people like to do this weird stuff where you try to line it up and just imagine maybe what it was like back then. I think there's room for everybody to play around with this. Of course, a photographer came down from not too far away, I think Missouri, and recorded one of the only 8 occasions where battlefield dead were recorded. Now, all these photos you've ever seen in books, and whatnot, showing dead on the battlefield, if they're actually dead, there are about 104 of them, and they were all recorded on 8 occasions. Okay, we just don't have that many. 4 at Corinth, we think at least. 20 at Antietam, 37 at Gettysburg, 22 at Petersburg, 1 at 2nd Fredericksburg, 6 at Spotsylvania, and I may have missed a couple there in there, but it's a pretty finite resource, and therefore we use these things. These dead Confederates out in front of the remnants of Battery Robinette, near where the visitor center is now, really speak to us to this day. Of course, after this stuff happened in Corinth, the Confederates do strike northward. There's going to be fighting at Munfordville and Richmond, some real Confederate victories, both with great stories. A lopsided victory at Richmond, and the Union was literally convinced to surrender at Munfordville. Fascinating stories. And then they went up to the lovely but unphotographed battlefield of Perryville in Kentucky, where the Union sort of struck back, but barely, man. After that, the tide of war is going to start to move in as we approach the end of 1862, where you have Sherman trying unsuccessfully to unhinge Vicksburg at Chickasaw Bayou or Bow. You've got the Battle of Fredericksburg, and of course you have Rosecrans moving down and confronting Bragg at the battlefield of Stones River, where we incredibly have just a couple of photos. These photographers, it was such a hassle to unhitch your horses and bring all your plates and travel to a place on roads that we can't even imagine now. And then just to take a few photos. I can only think that they probably set up a tent and they were selling photos to soldiers, and that's how they made their money. But man, we're always finding photos we didn't know about. Every year, we find photos that have never been published before, and I'm hoping we'll have more of this place. In this case, one of the earliest monuments of the Civil War, with some of the dead at Hell's Half Acre along the railroad at Stones River. In the meantime, of course, you have stuff going on further west on the edge of the Trans-Mississippi, of course, Grant's attempt to capture Vicksburg, and Vicksburg is one of the more photographed places of the West. And when I say that, I mean that there are 25 outdoor photos taken at Vicksburg in 1864, 1863 and 64. That's a lot for a Western place. Now, there are a few that have hundreds, but just a couple. Most of them are lucky to have even a handful of photos like Shiloh. This is, of course, the Shirley House, still the main extant building, I think the only extant building from the Civil War in the park. These are, of course, trenches from some Illinois soldiers. Man, I went back, I think I've been to Vicksburg 9 or 10 times. I tried every time. Finally, a key tree fell down, and I was able to get it really close, man. And you can still see the undulations of the ground where the dugouts were, but it's the same house in the same place, and there used to be a big tree right there, so I was really happy for that. Usually I'm an environmentalist, but not on battlefields. Scratch that, everybody. In the meantime, a photographer went, and during the operation south of Vicksburg will fall on July 4th, but all the way up until and beyond that, that's 1863, Port Hudson to the south finally fell to the Union. The Union had tried unsuccessfully there, and there were photographers there the whole time. This is one of the top 5 most photographed places of the Civil War, with more than 350 photos taken there. Of the 10,000, that's quite a bit, okay? Port Hudson very well photographed both during the operations and after. There's a newish book by my friend Larry Hewitt, where he really goes through and identifies and locates most of these things. And of course, the important part about this is that before Vicksburg and Port Hudson fell, there was a gap in the river through which the Confederates could get things across the river and access railroads and whatnot. Now that's closed, and when people say, you guys know this, when they say they cut the Confederacy in two, they literally quite did. The Confederates could not share this stuff with this half, at least not without a great deal of risk and a whole lot of trouble and expense. So this part of the Atacama Plan really eventually did work and made it even less likely that Confederate photographers or Southern photographers are going to have anything, to make photos with. Now, in the meantime, I've been talking about Westerners, but I haven't even shown any soldier portraits, and I think you all know that the soldiers of the West are simply different than the soldiers of the East. They might be the same people, they might worship the same gods, they might use the same money and read the same books, but they look different. You zoom in on them, and they have a relaxed appearance. You can see that they are simply rugged Westerners. And a lot of these guys are from Ohio, Illinois, Minnesota, and Indiana and Iowa, but just as many, or a good number of them, came from the East. You've got Pennsylvania and New York soldiers who sort of come into the Western culture. And when some of these Easterners showed up with their paper collars and, oh man, show's over. And nicely starched shirts, they were pretty well mocked by a lot of the Westerners. Let's see if this thing's still working. It's not like that last time, huh, Dana? So here's some Westerners. Look at these guys, man. Here's 44th Indiana. I can't remember if they're around Chattanooga. I think they are. Some of the officers look similar, but there's just something different about the look of the Western soldiers. I'm going to focus in on this guy in the front, who by far has the jauntiest hat, I think, of anybody in the Civil War. How's that thing even staying on? And man, this dude wanted to out-jaunty everybody else around him. There's just no way he wore it like that, except for the photo, right? Love this one. And even the chair looks Western. Look at these things, rough hewn. I think this is in Kentucky, some Illinois troops, in a tent here, and just everything about them screams it. And when Dana and Melissa often used to take a less known photo in Civil War times and say, well, where was this taken? Aha! One of the clues is, how do the soldiers look? Does it scream West or does it scream East? Does it scream early war with all their equipment and polish, or does it scream late war where they discarded with a lot of things? We can learn a lot about unidentified photos, and a whole lot of them are unidentified, just by getting to know the look of these soldiers. Here's some soldiers as well hanging out. These guys could look East or West, but what I find most interesting is in the immediate foreground, what in the world is going on there, okay? I really don't know what's happening. That is until I thought about it, of course, and then I realized, of course, what it is. It's the cousin. Those who have seen the Addams Family, good. And of course, the West has so many chops associated with it. We only talk about the battles, at least that's what I often talk about. But some of the most famous people, of course, of the Civil War are Westerners. I'm going to mostly talk about Yanks because, man, do these guys really come to the fore. In the South, of course, you've got the likes of Jefferson Davis and all sorts of others, and Patrick Claiborne has his ties to Arkansas and whatnot, but Abe Lincoln, of course, nominated in Chicago. You've got this guy on the left, Ulysses Grant, as a younger soldier, right after he got out of West Point. Incidentally, with Alexander Hayes without his beard, who you're going to see later. And of course, you're going to have Rutherford B. Hayes standing there in the back getting ready to be president. You've, of course, got William T. Sherman, George Armstrong Custer. So many of these guys came from the West. You can look at Hiram Granberry for the South, really, from Texas, and Henry Hopkins Sibley, and all these other people. A lot of these guys came from the West. As much as you have these guys in the East rising to the fore, the Civil War is won for the Union a lot by Westerners. Now, of course, because it's still in the West, even though it's on the Carolina coast, you've got the Battle of Fort Wagner in July of 1863. So the West becomes a real deal theater of war, while the world is focused upon the East, with the exception of a couple of important things like Vicksburg. The world is really focused on what's going on in the East. There's still all these actions going on in the West. Of course, at Fort Wagner, even before the Union attempted to capture it, and then later when the Confederates abandoned it, You've got an extensive photographic series being done by a group called Host and Peel, and they recorded this pretty uninteresting photo on the beach at Morris Island. Of course, Morris Island State Park by the American Battlefield Trust. Just seems to show people kind of just looking around until you look in the distance and you start to see, ooh, I see people looking at monitor ships here. You see them, they're sort of cheese boxes rising above them. And above, that's the USS Ironsides belching smoke out toward Confederate positions in and around Charleston City and around the harbor. This is as close as you get to combat photos in the Civil War. Remember I mentioned 3, 4, 5 seconds of exposure? That prevented it in part, plus the sheer danger of it. These guys didn't just show up and sort of say like, okay, everybody stand still, stop fighting. I mean, not only would it not show up, but this is dangerous stuff, okay? And a lot of people, I'm thinking specifically of a photo of some USCTs who are doing picket duty, and they're hiding, maybe it sounds familiar to some of you, they're hiding behind a house and they're shooting around the corner. And there's a picture of it. What's the photographer doing during that time? Just standing out in the open, hoping the enemy won't shoot him? No. These things were usually done under controlled conditions, including this, safely in a Union position on Union-held Morris Island, watching the fight from there. And that's about as close as we're going to get, okay? We have a Confederate photographer also getting, this is George Cook, securing photos from Fort Sumter at some of the monitors. You can see some smoke up here, actually operating against. Now, this was a dangerous photo to take, but I guess he took the risk. Those ships don't fire 20 times a minute, so I think he thought he was safe. In the meantime, we have 54 photos taken out of a place called Camp Nelson, one of the newest national parks in the country, out in Kentucky. We have photographers everywhere, Brownsville, Texas. We've got photos at Alcatraz Island. This is San Francisco Bay, all around there. And this series is one of only 3 instances when photographs were actually censored during the Civil War. You would think they'd be, these photos of the dead. Ooh, we don't want people to see them. All this was new. The government and the media didn't exactly know how to deal with these things, okay? So these were censored by the Secretary of War because he was afraid that their prison at Alcatraz might be undermined by the Confederates knowing about this. Anybody know some of the other 2 of the other occasions?
Lincoln's funeral.
Okay, so his funeral, or what do you mean?
It's lying in the casket.
Lincoln in the casket is another one of them. There's only one more, and we know it was taken. Anybody know? The autopsy of John Wilkes Booth on the monitor, Montauk. Like, we know it was taken. We know there was a plate, and supposedly there was one print made by Gardner's son or something like that, and man, maybe one day. That Lincoln casket photo didn't appear until about 30 years ago, so maybe there's hope now. Maybe it's a little bit morbid to think, oh, I hope that autopsy photo shows up. Man, that would be an interesting photographic find. So censorship was comparatively rare during the Civil War. Now, in the meantime, of course, William Stark Rosecrans engages in a famous and largely bloodless endeavor called the Tullahoma Campaign, in which he advances through a good portion of Tennessee, outflanks Bragg from Chattanooga, and then moves into Georgia, gets a little bit too much like of himself invested here, spreads himself out among Georgia. Braxton Bragg gets reinforcements from the east, namely in the form of James Longstreet, bringing 2 divisions with them, and strikes back the Battle of Chickamauga, by far the largest battle in the West. Nothing is really close, and we hardly have any photos of it. Again, we have photos along the roads, okay, where the roads took people. Photographers sometimes stopped and got this best-known photo at Chickamauga at Lee and Gordon's Mills. If you go up high enough onto the ridge, you can get a better one. This is a rebuilt structure. You can see there's some differences between them, actually, in the size of the structure. But if you go up the hill a little bit higher, you can get a better match than I provide here. And then I try to bend my photos in half and try to make them match so that they're doing the same, even though it's not the same building. So whatever you're into. Of course, for Chickamauga, one of the best things we have are Alfred or William Waud drawings. This is one of the most beautiful drawings of the Civil War, if you ask me. And sometimes when you have a photo, this is by far the next best thing. And unlike photographers, the sketch artist could be right there with the troops. All they needed was a pad and a pencil. They can make a quick sketch then, and then go back to the comfort of safety and finish that sketch a little bit later. Okay? Sometimes those very sketches will be made into engravings or woodcuts, or photographs could be. And those are what people would see in newspapers and magazines. Back then, you could not print what's called a half-tone photograph in a newspaper or magazine. That's all in one sentence so far, excuse me. All right, let's see what we have next. So of course, after the Union disaster at Chickamauga, I mean, people remember the Rock of Chickamauga as if he saved and won the day. No, I mean, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, helped stave off disaster well enough for the Union to retreat back to the safety of entrenchments and fortifications at Chattanooga. Bragg comes in command, victorious in the largest battle ever fought in the West, and then kind of half besieges the place, thinking he has nothing to worry about. Of course, that's not happening. The place isn't really besieged, and eventually the Union will open up a cracker line at Brown's Ferry over there, right over here. And that's going to allow them to feed the Army. They're no longer under any sort of threat. Then U.S. Grant shows up, and the Union really strikes back. The Union had been planning that, but Grant comes in, and things just happen when that guy is there. So here comes Grant. They take Orchard Knob, they capture Lookout Mountain, they capture Missionary Ridge, and Bragg is out of the Army for quite a while, and until near the end again. At Chattanooga, it has to be the second most photographed Union or Confederate place in the West. The Union Army was there for so long, photographers flooded in, recorded a whole bunch of pictures, and this is, I believe, a photo of the Crutchfield House, not bad looking structure there. And in the background, you might be able to see sort of a candy cane striped building on the left, and I think I can see Scott Keene over there. But you start to pay attention to those details, and you can then, look at it, commit it to memory, or just say it looks familiar, and then you see it in another photo. Here's the candy cane place, there's Scott Keene and company, and all of a sudden, okay, this is looking up that street. And no joke, if you start getting into these things and looking at photos and making connections, you can sort of create a virtual reality of your own, okay? And sometimes discover things that you're the only person alive who knows it, okay? It's not like there's 75 of me full-time just doing this stuff, okay? You can make a big dent by just downloading photos from the Library of Congress and seeing what you see and trying to make connections. And you know what? If you don't, I think you're going to find something interesting to you. People being people, stuff looking like it does, and I think you're going to learn. So I encourage it. One of the many other photos taken at Chattanooga, just thought I'd throw another one in there. And then, of course, my favorite photo of Chattanooga, although there's more to come, and that is Joseph Hooker standing, probably as the subject for a painting that's going to be made about him in front of the place, in front of the mountain he helped to capture. Hooker's a complicated character. He's much maligned for a lot of reasons. He'd probably be the guy you want to have a drink with but wouldn't trust, or put him in command of a corps, but maybe not the whole army. He's sort of a machinator, but here he is in front of the mountain that his troops indisputably captured at that point. And man, you could get to a very close spot, and it's still one of the proudest moments of my life that of the 10 or so people I was with when we went there, I convinced the most die-hard Confederate. He's from Vicksburg. This dude was a modern Confederate guy, and he was the tallest, so I made him be Hooker. And that is just, he did not like it. And the late Lamar McMillan, was sort of game to do it, and we tried to set it up pretty well. If we go back one more time, because Jim Ogden helped me find the spot. Pretty cool stuff. Of course, there are better known photos up here, and we just have more mysteries than anything else about U.S. Grant here. But this is Lookout Mountain, of course. This is Point Park, would be, right up here, and what we call the Point Rock, or Point Lookout, is right in the distance there, okay? Supposedly that's U.S. Grant standing chomping on a cigar. I'm not sure if either of those things are true. I can't confirm it's a cigar, I really don't think it is. And nobody can really confirm it's Grant, other than that the photographer said it was, okay? We really don't know. The photographer identifies members of his staff. None of these guys look like the members of the staff that they say it is. So it's pretty cool stuff. Now, if you can maybe see a little stump right here, that stump appears in other photos looking upward. In the very upper left, that thing sticking up is that stump, okay? That doesn't really matter for right now, but I'm just saying how high up they were, okay? And look at this, okay? Have you seen more rickety ladders in a more dangerous place, like in your life? Like, you gotta skip a rung here. Look, I think I have a close-up. I mean, how is he gonna get up to the top here, okay? And we might think that, life is cheap in the Civil War. They saw a lot of death and everything like that. I'm pretty sure these guys wanted to live as much as we do, okay? In fact, a photographer was setting somebody up on this rock. It's called Roper's Rock for a reason, despite the name on here. The photographer's name was Roper, and although the joke goes, okay, a little further back, and then the people he's photographing fall off. In this case, he fell off, head first. And this is an illustration from Frank Leslie's, and they're like, oh no. So it is a heavily photographed spot, and a photographer died right there at Point Lookout, and he had been a soldier, now he was dead, and it's forever known as Roper's Rock. And that brings me to something, man, that East and West, the Civil War people are sort of nuts. I mean, look, why these guys couldn't swim? They're supposed to get off these ships at Shiloh on what, a 2x6? And you're going to walk with your heavy bag and don't know how even to swim, and you're going to get off. And apparently this is common. You just start seeing these little boards everywhere. By the way, next to a cannon, okay? Look at these conditions. Where's OSHA? I mean, look at this thing up to its like hull up there and whatnot, and all this. So people took risks back then. I know, like, we didn't have the same, there is no safety net, by the way. You know, there's no FEMA, there's no real Red Cross yet. You had sort of imitators of it. I think if only there was a museum where you could learn about the development of the Red Cross, that would be really helpful. That was a joke, y'all. But when you start seeing people, I think they took the biggest, stupidest chances for photos. It's one thing to be brave in battle and try to capture a flag for the glory of it all. In this case, these guys on High Bridge, it's called that for a reason. Okay, who had no hope of being noticed or picked out in these photos, are standing on the world's most risky rail. Like, you know, right on the edge. Now, at least this guy has a friend holding his hand and whatnot, but they had no hope of even being seen, and you see that this is common, that wherever they go, and the biggest risks are out here on Point Lookout. Like, they don't have rubber-soled shoes, they are out on this thing, and then it became a competition. How close to the edge could I get? How disappointed do I want to make my parents in me, okay? So this guy's down on the lower part here. Then you've got these guys hanging out on the lower part. And by the way, this isn't like, okay, there's a shelf of rock right here, and you're just missing it. No. These guys fall. I've been there. I stood on that rock. You're going to die. There's no maybe about it or anything. So these guys just started getting into it, and you can see the steep drop that's going to be down there. And I think that, you know, these guys just went all the way to the edge. I mean, this guy at least has someone on his shoulder. He's down low. And then you've got, you know, us today never taking chances like that. I mean, who would go and do these things? We've learned, okay, from this stuff. I mean, we would never take these chances today because why? We're much smarter than people of the Civil War. And we want to go back and tell them how to perform their medical, amputations and how they should form their government because we're much smarter than the people of the past. We've certainly learned a lot. Of course, in the West, we have all sorts of military installations, a lot of them prisons, but you have bases such as Fort Snelling in Minnesota. I finally went, didn't get the right angle, but you get the idea. That building is still there. And you can walk into Fort Snelling, walk into this building where the 1st Minnesota, famous for their actions at Gettysburg, trained in part, many other units as well. Here is a yard, an ordnance yard in Cincinnati, Ohio. Here we've got these guys just got out of a prison, I think near Citronelle, Alabama. Of course, people talk about the prisons of the South and you only hear about Andersonville, but there are prisons in a whole lot of southern towns, and many of them absolutely terrible as they were in the North. At times in places like Camp Morton in Indianapolis, named after Governor Morton. The prison at Rock Island doesn't look too bad, but I think Rock Island, Illinois, near Chicago, in the winter is probably a little bit slightly unpleasant to be at. Camp Chase, Ohio, Elmira, New York. I really don't like to compare tragedies because these places were just terrible all around. Now, 1864 comes around, and I know everybody's familiar with the 2 big movements in 1864, one in the East and one in the West, but this was part of a 5-pronged movement that U.S. France is going to try to do, knowing the Confederates couldn't possibly parry every thrust. But he put the big ones under his most capable commanders, and the little ones under less so. And therefore you have Nathaniel Banks failing in the Red River Campaign. You have, on the anniversary of today, it's the 161st anniversary of the Battle of Newmarket, in the valley there under Franz Sigel, another real popular guy among Northern leadership. And then you've got Ben Butler's attempt to interdict between Richmond and Petersburg. And because none of these really produced any viable result, the Confederates are still strong when Sherman moves toward Atlanta and Grant and Meade move toward Richmond. Okay? And these remain the 2 big campaigns of the spring, summer, and beyond of 1864. Of course, when you look at Sherman's movements, he moves from Chattanooga by Chickamauga. They fight at Rocky Face Ridge. They fight at Resaca. They're going to fight at Dallas New Hope Church and Kennesaw Mountain. And, you know, there's a photographer there in 1864 who then comes back in 1866. His name is George Barnard. extraordinarily productive. He wanted to sell his pictures in a book, and did. Him and Alexander Gardner at the end of the war both produced, photographic books, and these books had to be individually printed, each photo printed and pasted onto every page, because until the early 1900s, you just couldn't make books that well reproduced photographs at all. Here is Barnard's photo, and I'm now seeing, I think maybe for the first time, what looks like his photographic wagon in the hellhole at New Hope Church. And then he got about 4 photos taken here at Kennesaw Mountain. This one probably being the most famous, showing what is probably I think it's called a Hardin Cabin. And that is Little Kennesaw Mountain there, and this is called Pigeons Hill. It's all preserved by the National Park Service, a sort of oasis. It's a sea of development at Atlanta. Now, if you go up top, Barnard also took 2 photos looking down the other way. This one, that shows the same tree line in the background as this one. In other words, they took photos across one another. I'm going to get a little technical here. But first, you might be able to see these rocks way down at the bottom there. Well, the park knows exactly where they are, and they are along Cockrell's Line. I mean, I don't think anybody could deny that these are the same rocks. They're in the right spot, the terrain works, and rocks tend to look like they were, okay? Now, when I started looking at those rocks, then I figured out which direction it was looking. Okay, I know where it's looking. And I thought that maybe I could find that cabin in the distance. And then I found what looked like a structure here with a distinctive chimney, and started looking to see if I was looking in the opposite direction of the photo. And it turns out we were. Because photographers tended to take a lot of photos at one place. They didn't tend to take 2 photos, move 10 miles away, and take 2 more photos. They wanted to maximize their composition while they were watering their horses and doing things like this. And when these things work out, this isn't like other elements of Civil War research, where you might have 40 accounts that say one thing, you find 2 that find another, and you talk about them all, and you say, you know what, the weight of the evidence is with the 40, you know, but there were these dissenters. With Civil War photography and this then and now stuff, you know, everything started to work out. Once I knew where the house was in both photos, the little tree clump and some of the debris showed up in both photos, the road showed up in both photos, and everything started to come together. So again, I want to encourage this work. Now, once I knew that they were taking in opposite directions, I was able to figure out which road that is, Burnt Hickory Road, and figure it out pretty well and nail where these things were all taken. Of course, I wish that some of the little rocks I could see in here suddenly appeared when I went there, and they didn't. So the work goes on. I mean, rocks have a way of getting blown up for roads and whatnot. I just want to say that, you know, some of you mentioned the videos when I came in. I just want to share with you something that it seems like most people, from what I can tell on Facebook, most people don't know that social media channels, YouTube and Facebook, are searchable. Okay? If you find this thing, you can search not all of YouTube, but just that channel. Okay? And I get questions every single day. Did you ever do a video on this? Or better yet, why didn't you do a video on this? I get accused every day. Why do you hate my grandfather? Because you obviously have never shot anything at Fort Monroe. Without doing this simple thing, okay? So when you're looking to see what we've covered in the West, and the American Battlefield Trust where I work, we have gone a long way to ask our members to support trips to the West, and we've taken now 5 trips to West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, into Georgia, and we're really starting to deal with our lack of Western coverage. So it's an appropriate thing to talk about while we're doing this. Also, you could search Civil War photography or Civil War photo. You're going to get a whole number of things that are going to pop up. So I just thought I'd say this. And yeah, I'm going to talk about that top one a little bit later. Now the photographers continued along with Sherman after Atlanta fell, where Sherman goes past Kennesaw Mountain, makes it to Atlanta, and here you have the somewhat fresh battlefield of Atlanta, supposedly east of the city. In the meantime, the Battle of Mobile Bay is going to rage in August of 1864. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Eventually Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan are going to fall, and the bay falls, but Mobile itself hangs on until the very end of the war. But you have photographers going there and getting something like 13 photos. Mine's blurry, I'm sorry. Here, this is a now and then showing some of the quarters and some of the moat and other things around Fort Morgan. Super impressive place to go, but you've got to want to get there. It's something like 2 hours from Mobile proper just to drive around the Horn. Or you could drive to Fort Gaines and take the ferry across and it's operating. Okay? Now, a whole lot is going on during all these things, and I'm leaving most of it out, but while a few things are happening, of course, Atlanta falls, okay, Sherman starts marching to the sea. Hood says, I can't really stop him, so I'm gonna march in the north. In the meantime, Lincoln wins re-election, okay, amidst all this. It was a pretty heady time at this time, and that was sort of like the South's last great hope, that maybe if McClellan could have been, elected, then there's going to be, a peace platform and the South can go its own way. After this, the South had very limited chances to do anything. Of course, I think you know what happens with John Bell Hood. He gets held up in Alabama, then eventually moves up, misses an opportunity at Spring Hill, and then they're going to fight the terrible, terrible Battle of Franklin right around, I guess by that time, William Tecumseh Sherman has done his march to the sea. He ends up at Fort McAllister. They find mines on the land side to get to the Confederate position. So a lot of these guys, and you can see their footprints, actually march onto the beach and try to undermine the Confederate position in the Battle of Fort McAllister. This is December of 1864. And there's an extensive series of dozens of photos taken around Fort McAllister around that time. Beautiful shots, as a matter of fact. Look at that moving boat coming toward us. It's a pretty cool scene. There's a whole lot more. In this case, these specially made wagons just to carry artillery rounds, because these things are heavy. Sometimes they put out the stuff you need in nearby facilities, so you can actually kind of line it up. And although I think we have a little easier, there's nothing in ours. So I think we have it a little bit easier. Of course, Sherman takes Savannah, famously gives it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift in 1864, and then Atlanta is in ruins. The Confederates burned a lot on their way out. There's a whole lot of terrible explosions. This is probably the most famous photo showing the rolling mill right on the outside of Atlanta proper. I show you this because sometimes a guy like George Barnard, who recorded this, wanted to make it even more beautiful. So he's going to take that photo and reprint it 2 or 3 more times to achieve clouds, okay? Until I pointed out, it's not that clear why clouds don't really show up in Civil War photographs. I mean, of course, it's like now, they had clouds in the sky, but because of the blue light spectrum, you have a few things. People with blue eyes look like ghosts, okay? And clouds just hardly ever show up. So in order to do this, you have to burn it in using old-style darkroom tactics. If anybody else has done this stuff in the darkroom, you have to burn it in, and sometimes you start to see the same clouds in different photographs, like the same cloud patterns. They mixed it up. They put them upside down and sideways, because, clouds can be clouds. But I thought I'd tell you this. These guys were artists, okay? They know that they were documentarians, but they were really artists. There's a lot of science involved. They were even called photographic artists, East and West. Now, the photographic record they left for Atlanta and vicinity was substantial. There are, scores of photos taken around Atlanta, making it one of the most photographed documentary places in the Western theater here. And when you start looking around, and, this stuff was sitting around for 150 years before I started looking at it, and before me and a few others started noticing this same tree northwest of Atlanta at a place called Fort X. I was like, okay, well, I know this tree is near the famous Ponder House, the one that you sometimes see all battered, and I can see the same tree looking in that direction, another direction, and through that I started realizing that a lot of these photos were also connected. Almost every time I start looking at these things, you see the photographers maximize their composition by simply turning their camera in different directions. I had suspected that these 2 photos were taken almost back to back, and eventually I found it. I found the same little sort of nipple-looking sandbag, as well as a pine tree growing right out of the sandbag in those 2. And all of a sudden, instead of having a photo just taken there, I know that it's there and there. I almost have a panorama in the background, right? Now, when you look in the background of one of these photos, say here, you can see what looks like a sort of a damaged house or a woodshed, okay, back in the distance. I'm like, oh my God, that looks familiar. I've seen a woodshed with the front of it missing before, okay? Well, that kind of looks like a similar house, but that's not enough. So look at it from both directions, and you suddenly immediately see, sorry about the resolution here, a curved tree. I don't know why that looks like that way, but trust me, that's this tree. That's in the same direction. I could see intervening trees in the meantime, and suddenly I knew where that photo was taken too. And because we know where Fort X was on the Georgia Tech campus, we can nail this down to square feet, like where these photos were taken, and that's what we're trying to do. If a place is lost, at least we could set up a sort of virtual reality thing where we know roughly what it looked like and what was where. Once we know that, we can start looking in other directions. And just things like you see here, I was wondering about these two, so I started looking at the floorboards here, and then you have just clearly, this notch is that notch, and this long one is next to it. These things don't happen by accident. Plus, if it doesn't happen, you should be strictly concerned that maybe your theory is wrong, okay? Because this photographic stuff, like I said, it's not a popularity contest. For where something was taken, it's either 100% right or 100% wrong, okay? So if you're going to engage in this, you have all the tools you need to try to solve mysteries and learn about the Civil War. It's pretty cool. Even in this photo here, I wondered whether this gun was the same gun that you could see in another famous photo. It sort of looked similar to me, but I didn't know. You can even read the serial number on the front of that one there. But I really didn't know until I started looking at the sandbags, and I realized they were the same because those are unique. And then you can still see this gun at Kennesaw Mountain. If you look at the serial numbers, they're the same. Now that's kind of cool, okay? All of a sudden you have a gun in Atlanta, you can go, well, if you set off the alarm, you can touch that barrel, and I've done it. It's pretty cool. Wow. And there it is. So you can really see that it's 1,229 pounds as a barrel. You see 1863, the inspector's initials, TJR, I think it is. And you see it's the 211th gun to come out of that foundry that year. So pretty cool stuff, okay? In the meantime, while Sherman was marching to the sea and while he was about to do the Battle of Fort McAllister, we get back to the terrible Battle of Franklin, where the Battle of Franklin Trust has done a great job restoring the Carter House Gin. You're seeing the Carter House Gin up there. The foundation is now over there. I was finally able to record this photo and give it a somewhat similar look in 2024. Of course, the Confederates aren't going to exactly lose that battle. They stay at the entrenchments until dark, but nobody thinks that they really succeeded there. They're going to lose 6 generals. It's the most costly battle for Confederate generals in the whole war, and it's much smaller than a lot of other battles, speaking all the more to the terrible toll of it. Of course, afterward, Hood, for no good reason, it appears, easy for me to say, I'm not a military general, I've never been in command of an army, but he didn't seem to be able to didn't have a lot of prospects when he moved on to Nashville in the winter to try to capture the place. Maybe a month earlier he could have, but by now the Union's getting 10, 20, 30, 60,000 soldiers there to oppose his 20,000 that's left in his army. And this does not go well. The Battle of Nashville will basically end not only Hood's career, but the Army of Tennessee, which will be reduced by 3/4 in 1 month, okay, with people going home and people getting killed, wounded, and captured, okay? Now here's a photo taken. You can see some distinctive hills in the background. We're looking over toward Fort Negley, but I wasn't sure at the time, and I started wondering how I could prove it without too much work, and then I saw the squiggle in the marble. Well, the state capitol's still there. Certainly the squiggle should still be there, and it is, okay? So if you start to think about these things, and you start to think about place, the way you think about other sources when you start to learn about the Civil War, you can not only find these places, you know which direction these photos are looking, but also you can have someone pose Vanna White style and show off the sort of squiggle there. That's my former colleague Connor there. You also see that some of the photos taken from that capitol, this is the same spot. In fact, you see that house on the left? I'll wager I can show you that house. No, I can't. It looks like it's off to the right. Sorry, guys. But here's a 2-plate panorama that is, supposedly misty, and it is captured as being taken during the Battle of Nashville. But the Battle of Nashville was a few miles south of the actual capital. But supposedly these people are watching the battle and listening to the distant boom of artillery. We've got a few photos like that. Now, less known to, Civil War sort of newbies and better known to Civil War buffs is that after Sherman went and captured Atlanta, he is then going to, Atlanta and then Savannah, he's then going to strike off in 2 columns to the north, okay? It's called the Carolinas Campaign. They're going to move through South Carolina. Columbia will burn probably by Confederates trying to keep stuff out of Union hands. They're going to move in multiple columns, and they're eventually going to go up into North Carolina, and that will result in 2 battles, the Battle of Aversboro, or Aversboro. Here's the burned, one of the 7 photos taken in Columbia, South Carolina after it burned. And then they're going to fight in the Carolinas. But before I do that, I guess I don't have anything. Let me finish this up. So they're going to fight at the Battle of Aversboro, then they're going to fight at the Battle of Bentonville. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston kind of brought back, and Braxton Bragg is under him. The Fayette McLaws is there at Bentonville. Johnston knew I could do no more than annoy Sherman. okay? And he's telling Jefferson Davis, we don't have any bullets and we don't have any money to buy more. They have more soldiers. We're losing, 100 a day. And he had to convince Jefferson Davis to allow him to enter peace negotiations with William T. Sherman. Now, in the meantime, in the North, you're going to have Robert E. Lee surrender on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox. And on that same day, Alabama's largest battle will be waged, the Battle of Fort Blakely, where an attack bigger than Pickett's charge, 16,000 Union soldiers are going to move out toward 9 Confederate redoubts, and the Southerners are 6 feet apart at that point. They don't have a battle line, they have a skirmish line. The Confederates will lose all of their positions. The Union captures Fort Blakely, and that will result in the fall of Mobile, Alabama, in just one of the last actions of the Civil War, fought on the same day as Appomattox, okay? In the meantime, the Union is psyched, okay? 5 days later, they gather back at Fort Sumter to raise the flag over the place 4 years after it had fallen down. So we've got a whole lot of 1865 photos showing Fort Sumter, and you can really see in some of them how the place was just battered almost to just a ruin. Now, if you look toward the middle of this photo, you can see Henry Ward Beecher, who was involved in Bleeding Kansas, who was handing out Beecher's Bibles, which really meant guns, to people who would support his interests for the North in Kansas, is there giving a convocation, and there next to him is Major Robert Anderson, the brave defender of Fort Sumter at the beginning of the war. And I just don't think this was generally known until a couple of us zoomed in and said, this guy, and I'm sorry about the quality here, but this guy's got generals, straps on. Okay, which generals would have been there exactly? And it was Major Robert Anderson, promoted here, just hanging out, apparently with his cane in Fort Sumter. Of course, there's more acts in the drama. Sherman does meet with Joe Johnston. It's going to be a lengthy surrender process, and if you learn anything about this, I think you're going to be happy that you did. There's almost a fist fight outside with Wade Hampton and Judson Kilpatrick. There's drinking, there's negotiating, there's flipping out in Washington so bad that Grant comes from Washington to Raleigh, North Carolina, just to talk to Sherman, like, what are you doing? Like, you just signed something that would allow the Confederates to reestablish slavery. I don't think that's good. Okay, so this eventually will happen. It's the largest surrender of the Civil War because Joseph E. Johnston had a lot more people under his purview at the time than Robert E. Lee. In the meantime, of course, armies east and west are going to go to Washington, D.C., and they're going to march up Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol with its finished dome in the distance by the Willards Hotel on the left, and then by the Executive Mansion there. And at the Executive Mansion, there is a reviewing stand here, okay? And there are 45 photos taken of the Grand Review. People have looked at these all the time and said, oh my God, we know that you can see U.S. Grant in some of them. And you can even pick out the Quartermaster General in some of them. But one day, right in 2015, I just happened to look at the other side of the negative. Remember, most Civil War photos are taken in stereo with a twin lens camera, so that gives you both sides of the negative. And somehow when I looked at that side of that negative, I started seeing things you couldn't see on the other side. Winfield Scott Hancock, watching the Grand Review, that's him on the left, okay? And more important, if I may, probably the most populous shot showing dignitaries of the Civil War. That's Eli Parker, he's on Grant's staff. You can see the blur of the artillery going by in front of the veteran Reserve Corps soldiers. U.S. Grant looking right at the camera here. Next to him, Edwin Stanton whispering into the ear of the new president, Andrew Johnson, okay? Next to him, Leslie Merritt, okay? Looking at a bespectacled George Gordon Meade, okay? Looking back this way. The Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells, a guy named Dennison, William T. Sherman with his white glove whispering something to Dennison or talking to him, and the Quartermaster General of the United States, Montgomery Meigs. You've got the President, the Secretary of the War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Commander of all the armies, and the commanders of the two biggest armies, and the Quartermaster, all in one tight spot right here. And there it sat until 2015, and I've never seen anybody know this. And I'm not tooting a horn. All I did was take the time to look at it, okay? Which is why I stress in these talks that you download these photos in high resolution and see what you'll learn. You won't always make a discovery, but you'll probably find something you enjoy if you're a Civil War, what is it, geek, buff, nerd, loser, depending on your level, okay? Now let me end with just like a little story here, okay? So this is one of the most famous photos of the Civil War. It adorns the front of the Ken Burns book that accompanies the probably still best documentary ever made about the Civil War. This is Camp Griffin outside of Washington, D.C. And not only do you see some cool things here, not only are these rocks still there in a Virginia neighborhood, this is all houses now and whatnot. But if you watch one of my favorite shows of all time, Seinfeld, it's like Jerry's really getting on a lane here, you know. But in the background of that, every time, there's that photo hanging on his wall in Seinfeld. Okay, I'm still not done. Because that photo was taken by a guy named George Houghton. George Houghton, later, after the Civil War, he took a lot of Vermont photographs. He took several dozen photos in the Virginia campaigns in 1862 and whatnot. And then eventually he's going to apply his trade somewhere else. He's going to move to what we call the Wisconsin Dells. Okay? And in the Wisconsin Dells, he's going to open up in that building, and he is going to ply his trade for a while. He's going to be buried in an unmarked grave right here in the foreground. And in the background, you might be able to see something gated there. And that is the grave of Belle Boyd, the famous Confederate spy. Okay, so you've got this guy that took this photo that appears on Seinfeld's walls, and then he moves to the Wisconsin Dells. He's buried in an unmarked grave next to the one of the most famous spies of the Confederacy in the Wisconsin Dells, where several decades later, yours truly was born. I'm sorry, it was conceived in the Wisconsin Dells. I'll tell you all about that now. Sorry, just kidding. So when I was conceived there, my parents loved telling me that. Then I, of course, grew up in Chicago. That is, of course, what brings me to y'all today. And it was in this high school, Evanston Township, when I was a D history student, that I just happened to pick up this Frazanito book. And I turned to the Dunker Church page, and that was that. And I've been obsessed ever since. And to that end, to the end that people thank me for what I do, or hey, I watch your videos and everything, I am just a Civil War nerd who happens to make videos that people watch. So I so appreciate you coming out tonight. Listen to what I have to say, and thank you. Michelle, about right, maybe a tiny bit over. I wasn't getting the action. But I think we might have time for a question or six. Sir?
You mentioned that a lot of times you can place the photographs in relation to each other.
Yes.
Has anybody taken software and tried to overlap them?
Oh, yeah.
And create, I mean, it seems like the potential is there, even if the angles are different with modern.
The answer is yes. I mean, some National Park Service sites, like Gettysburg and Andersonville, they do sort of insets where they take photos now and they place them in there, and sometimes you got to mash them together. And we work with an outfit called Wide Awake Films, and if you ever want to Google it, Step Into History on YouTube, where the photos exist in history in a modern landscape, and you sort of move into them and you can look left and right within them a little bit. The answer is yes, in different ways. Perfectly no, but well enough to make it super cool. Is the answer. Sure.
I have a quick question about when you say you wouldn't it be very interesting to find plates? Where do we find those plates? Where do they show up?
Yeah, so brand new glass plates are pretty uncommon. Okay, sometimes they'll show up like in yard sales and antique stores, but mostly what we're finding is what I would call a discovery. In other words, it's a photo. Either it's never been printed before or published before, and it's the only known print of it that nobody has ever exposed to the public before, or a print that has been long known to be within the collections of a museum, but nobody there or who has ever used it knew what it was. Okay? I'll give a good example. It's not a photo, but the best example I know of it is that for decades, we thought there was only one annotated burial map of the Civil War in the detail that we get at Gettysburg. Okay? Gettysburg was the only place. And then all of a sudden, my friend Tim Smith was looking around online at the New York Public Library and was trying to pull up the Gettysburg map, and then he saw Hagerstown Pike, and he realized just then that there was a Antietam burial map, which he happened to discover just within a month of time when it would have been too late to put it into the new visitor center there, so I'm really glad he did. And this is an example where it had been digitized years earlier, but nobody there and nobody who had gone to examine it knew what they were looking at, Okay, so that's the same thing with the photos. If you have a photo and you don't know what it shows, it's not useless, it might be cool to look at. But all of a sudden, once you know ideally when and where a photo was taken, that piece of paper or that print is transformed into a document, a historical document, more rich in information than almost everything else. So that's what I mean. It's usually that it's either never been printed or that nobody knew what they were looking at before. And by the way, what I just described is the work of William Frazanito. That's what he does. He takes photos out of the fine arts field and makes them historical documents by learning about what was happening at the moment that they were exposed. So, sorry, that's a lot. I love the subject. Anything else? Sir? Yes, you, sir. I usually don't call you sir, Dave. My apologies.
All right. I just, what you're saying, I think too, we've gotten so used to like cruising around on the internet, and some of those older books, like the compilations William C. Davis did, and the Miller's Photographic History, if you look in they're grainy and the images don't look great, but you see stuff in there that just isn't used a lot today. It was been forgotten.
Yeah, so what he's referring to are some of the great series. Now, Miller's Photographic History, they didn't have the ability to know and compare these photos. It was the first time it was ever published. There was a lot of mistakes in Miller's, a lot of photos miscaptioned. Less so in the masterpiece, 6-volume Image of War series by William C. or Jack Davis, who also did 2 more called Touched by Fire. And then there's just been a number of additional series by the individual repositories and by some of the authors like Bob Zeller and others in the field, where, man, we are getting down to the minutia, and the whole field has come a long way since Frazanito sort of introduced it to us, this idea of the actual study of Civil War photographs, okay? I'm curious, by the way, if I'm the only one who I keep these books right next to my desk at home, and I'm constantly looking at my Millers and my Jack Davis and everything like that, and if I want to see a detail in the book, God, I'm embarrassed of it, but I'll go, I go out to the paper and try to pinch and zoom in. I hope I'm not the only, you don't have to admit it, but I can't be the only one okay, I can't be the only one in the room who does it, okay? But we've gotten so spoiled that the grainy photos in these books, they're magical, and often, again, that's the only time you see them, so I think they still serve a great purpose. One more, last one for now.
I'm intrigued by the photograph of Grant and Johnson and all of the people. So again, tell me what that one was about. They were reviewing the troops after.
Yes. So there was a 2-day review in Washington, not of all the troops, but of some of the armies whose terms were expired or had expired. It's the Army of the Potomac, it's the Army of the Cumberland, it's the Army of the James, excluding a lot of the black soldiers who were involved. And they're just watching, and I think that is just incredible. You can see people just watching all of these people that they heard about, like, that scene in Titanic, there's the Duchess of Roths, that's the richest man on the ship. These units are like, that's the 7th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Like, they've been learning of these units in the newspapers, and suddenly they're marching by with flags flying in the Capitol, and everything, and for 2 days. And in the photos you can see Grant and Sherman and other people. Sometimes they're not there. I mean, it's a 2-day process. These guys got up, used the bathroom, got some food, and they just marched by the executive mansion literally hour after hour. And it was a huge celebration, even though some would say the war maybe wasn't technically over by late May, but definitely close enough. And you can almost put yourself in the moment, especially when you zoom in, and just imagine what this would have sounded like, smelled like, and been like. So
Yeah.
the Grand Review is a fascinating subject.
Yeah, and what they were talking about.
Oh my God, what's Sherman saying to Denison? I mean, it could literally be like, I like your tie. or it could be about the Civil War. I mean, you ever notice this? You might meet your history hero, and they want to talk about Buck Rogers or something. You just want to talk about Civil War. But you find that these people have other lives.
Right.
And maybe they're really interested in the Olympics or something like that. So I think these guys were as complex as us.
Were there many photographs of that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I said last question. There were about 42 taken of the Grand Review, not just here, at the White House, further up Pennsylvania Avenue, but the most are taken here and at that bend I showed you an earlier picture of, showing the Willard's Hotel. There is a bunch, at least 15 taken right from here, just as the armies move by. And some of the units are identified too, which is pretty cool. So I don't hold everybody up. I'll still be around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Thanks to the Frederick County Civil War Roundtable. I have some books back there if anybody's interested. Those are hard to come by if you want, no pressure. And thanks to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine for hosting us today. Thanks, y'all.
folks and things. Again, this is our last meeting for the season. We will be seeing you all in September for our field trip. We're going to be heading out to Middletown to check out their new visitor center, check out their film. That's going to be the opening of next season in September. So keep an eye on your email for the newsletter, the summer issue of the newsletter. We're going to have our speakers lined up for you with the topics in that email, in that newsletter. And we'll have a little bit of information on the summer trip. But again, thank you everybody for coming out this season. It's been an absolute pleasure, and y'all have a great night and safe travels.